The ice cracked like a gunshot under the silent Arctic dawn, a reminder that nothing here was safe. The narrator said, "Life in this place begins not with peace but with fracture." A great polar bear named Marcus hauled his massive frame across a thinning ice sheet, every step a gamble against death. His breath steamed against the biting wind, and his eyes carried both hunger and dread. A lone seal pup broke the surface nearby, gasping in innocence, unaware that the world itself was betraying it. Marcus growled softly, torn between instinct and the cruel reality of vanishing ground. The narrator said, "This is not a hunt, it is a reckoning." The ice shifted again, splitting further, isolating him from his prey. Nature was no longer a stage for predator and prey. It was the executioner. By the 30-second mark, the audience already knew. Survival was collapsing, and there would be no mercy here. The Arctic wind roared like a warning, sweeping across miles of broken sea ice. The narrator said, "For Marcus, hunger is no longer measured in days but in heartbeats." His ribs pressed faintly against his thick coat, a silent testimony of decline. Once a ruler of ice and hunter of seals, he now stood betrayed by his frozen kingdom. The floes drifted apart like shattered glass, each piece pulling him further from life. A gull screamed overhead, circling like a scavenger waiting for his fall. Marcus pressed forward, determined, though every step weighed heavier. The narrator said, "In this wilderness, fragility is louder than strength." His shadow stretched thin across the blue-white wasteland, fading as the sun climbed. The ice groaned beneath Marcus' weight, a chorus of collapse echoing across the sea. The narrator said, "This land is dying, and with it, its monarchs." He paused, muzzle lifting, nostrils flaring as he searched for the faint scent of prey. Yet the air carried nothing but salt and despair. The floe beneath him tilted slightly, water sloshing dark against its edges. His claws scraped the surface, anchoring him in futility. In the distance, a pod of seals rested on thicker ice, untouchable across widening gaps. The narrator said, "For every mile he drifts, life drifts further still." Marcus's breath grew ragged, but his eyes burned with the defiance of one not yet ready to surrender. A sudden crack thundered through the silence, jolting Marcus into a crouch. The narrator said, "In the Arctic, death rarely announces itself twice." The floe shuddered, breaking from beneath like a trap door to the abyss. Marcus lunged forward, muscles straining as ice splintered behind him. His claws scraped, throwing shards into the air, and he roared in desperation. Water surged upward, black and merciless, swallowing fragments whole. For a heartbeat, his massive form hovered at the edge, then slammed onto a narrow strip of ice, chest heaving. The narrator said, "Even kings stumble when the throne beneath them crumbles." The sea roared louder, and the hunt was no longer about prey. It was about land itself. The ice steadied under Marcus's paws, but the horizon betrayed him. The narrator said, "The Arctic offers no shelter, only illusions of survival." He scanned the desolate stretch, floes drifting like broken bones across the sea. His belly growled, a low rumble louder than the wind. Hunger pressed sharp against his ribs, and his eyes flickered with desperation. In the distance, a rival bear traced the edge of another floe, younger, leaner, unscarred. Marcus froze, instincts sharpening, knowing this was not a hunt but a contest. The narrator said, "On melting ice, even predators must fear their own kind." The opening shock had begun. The stage was no longer prey and predator, but predator against time itself. The sun rose low, casting pale gold across the Arctic, but warmth did not follow. The narrator said, "Marcus no longer walks as a hunter, but as a survivor of silence." His body, scarred and weathered, carried the weight of lost hunts and broken ice. He paused at the edge of a floe, staring at the horizon as if searching for something long gone. The scars on his muzzle told of past battles, but hunger left deeper wounds no eye could see. A faint whimper echoed, not prey but life itself. The narrator said, "This is not the tale of power, it is the tale of fragility." His gaze softened, For beyond the drift of ice lay something he could not ignore, the fragile spark of innocence. From the shadows of a shallow ice den, a cub emerged, tiny paws stumbling across brittle snow. The narrator said, "Emily is the fragile heart of this story." Her fur glistened with newness, eyes wide, blinking at the blinding sky. Marcus lowered his head, watching her movements with a mix of pride and dread. The world she entered was already fractured, yet her innocence gave it weight. A gull swooped low, startled by her squeak, before vanishing into the gray horizon. The narrator said every breath she takes is defiance against inevitability. Marcus shifted closer, his shadow falling over her like a shield, though he knew he could not shield her from what the ice had already chosen. Emily pressed her nose into Marcus's fur, a tiny warmth against his weathered hide. The narrator said, "Even giants seek reason to endure." His eyes softened, though his ribs told a harsher truth. He had little left to give. She pawed at the ice playfully, ignorant of the fractures beneath, while he nudged her back gently with his muzzle. A soft growl escaped him, not in warning, but in tenderness. The narrator said, "Here lies the emotional anchor, the fragile against the fading." For Marcus, every ounce of strength remained tethered not to himself, but to the cub trembling at his side. The Arctic had no mercy, but in her gaze he found something that still resembled hope. The wind howled across the floes, lifting snow into thin veils, yet Emily chased it with playful pounces. The narrator said, "Innocence knows nothing of collapse." Marcus followed, slow but steady, his heavy paws sinking deeper with each step. Hunger pulled at him, yet his gaze never left her. A sudden crack beneath her startled squeak, and he lunged forward, nudging her back from the fissure. His growl echoed across the void, not at her, but at the world itself. The narrator said, "Every danger sharpens when it threatens the innocent." Emily nestled against his chest, her small form trembling, as the Arctic reminded them that love had no power against ice breaking apart. The horizon stretched wide, painted in cold blues and endless silence. Marcus lay down, chest heaving, while Emily curled against him. The narrator said, "This is what can be lost, not strength, but tenderness." His scars seemed softer with her pressed close, yet hunger sharpened in his eyes. She nuzzled into his chest, paws tucked under, dreaming against the rhythm of his breath. The ice groaned again, distant, cruel, but for a moment he ignored it. The narrator said, "Empathy is born not from might, but from fragility." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, carrying not just his weight but hers, knowing that the Arctic would test both long before it spared either. The Arctic wind screamed as if carrying a warning, rattling loose shards of ice like bones in a graveyard. The narrator said, "Hunger sharpens its teeth against Marcus, every hour cutting deeper." His ribs strained against his thick coat, yet his eyes never left Emily stumbling near him. He sniffed the air, but no prey came. Instead, shadows moved on a distant floe, another bear, younger, stronger, unscarred. Marcus froze, nostrils flaring, the weight of rivalry crashing over him. Emily pressed closer, unaware of what lurked across the divide. The narrator said, "Conflict rises not from prey, but from predator against predator." In the melting kingdom, strength was no longer enough. Survival demanded sacrifice. The rival bear paced, muscles taut, eyes fixed on Marcus's weakened frame. The narrator said, "Competition in the wild is not cruelty, it is inevitability." Marcus lowered his head, growling deep, but his body betrayed his age. Emily pressed against him, tiny paws trembling, her gaze flickering toward the looming figure. The ice between them cracked further, drifting them apart, yet the rival remained patient, watching, waiting. The narrator said, "Every weakness is an invitation." The air thickened with silence, broken only by the groan of shifting ice. Marcus bared his teeth, not for dominance, but for protection. The Arctic was no longer just a stage of survival, it was a battlefield. A sudden gust lifted snow into spirals, cloaking the ice in shifting veils. The narrator said, "Nature itself presses on the fracture." Marcus moved forward, his paws heavy, muscles trembling beneath scarred fur. Emily stumbled, but clung to his side, her tiny whimper lost in the roar of the storm. The rival stood still, unshaken, his eyes gleaming with hunger. The floes creaked, grinding against one another like bones, pushing Marcus further into danger. The narrator said, "Each step costs more than the last." Marcus snarled, forcing courage into the storm, though he knew this rising conflict was not one he could escape. It would only break. The rival leapt onto a nearer floe, the crash echoing like thunder across the water. The narrator said, "Every contest grows sharper when distance shortens." Marcus pushed Emily back gently, a silent plea for her to stay hidden behind his frame. His growl deepened, though his breath came ragged. The rival advanced, younger muscles rippling under bright fur, claws carving lines into the ice. Marcus braced, scarred body lowering into defense. The narrator said, "Conflict is not choice but burden." Emily whimpered, eyes wide with fear, the sound slicing through the howl of the Arctic. The stage of survival tightened, and the battle was no longer distant. The world shrank to the space between two bears, predator against predator, father against hunger. The narrator said, "This is the rising conflict, not survival alone, but survival contested." Marcus's eyes burned with fury, his scarred muzzle inches from collapse. Emily whimpered, trembling at the edge of ice, her innocence a knife cutting through the weight of violence. The rival snarled, young and merciless, stepping closer as cracks spread under his paws. The floe groaned, carrying the sound of doom into the void. The narrator said, "Conflict always comes at the cost of something fragile." For Marcus, the fight was no longer his own. It was hers. The ice groaned like a living creature, splitting further as the bears faced one another. The narrator said, "What seemed a simple contest hides a deeper truth." Marcus braced, but his eyes caught something unexpected. The rival's ribs showed faintly through his bright coat. The younger bear was not thriving, but starving. His snarl was not of dominance, but desperation. Emily whimpered, pressing tighter against Marcus, as if she too sensed the revelation. The narrator said, "Predator against predator is never black and white. Both are trapped in a war against the same executioner, the melting ice." In that moment, Marcus realized his enemy was not the rival, but the world collapsing beneath them. The rival's growl faltered, shifting into heavy panting, his sides heaving with exhaustion. The narrator said, "Hunger unites even enemies." Marcus's eyes narrowed, torn between instinct and recognition. Emily peered from behind his fur, her innocence reflecting only fear. The rival staggered, claws slipping on ice. But his gaze never left Marcus' cub. Not cruelty, survival. The narrator said, "Every hunter is also hunted by time." The ice shivered again, waves lapping closer as if to remind them both of their irrelevance. Marcus's snarl softened, for he understood. This was not strength against weakness, but weakness mirrored in another form. A shadow swept over the floes, not a predator, but the sky itself shifting into storm. The narrator said, "The hidden truth is revealed. The greatest enemy is not each other, but the world collapsing beneath them." Snow began to fall in jagged flurries, stinging eyes and fur. Emily squeaked, pressing into Marcus's chest as the rival raised his head toward the sky, blinking against the snow. Hunger, rivalry, innocence, all dwarfed by the storm rising. The narrator said, "In nature, there is no villain, only survival clawing against inevitability." The revelation cut deeper than any fang. The true predator was the climate itself. The storm howled, scattering snow in violent sheets, blinding the horizon. The narrator said, "Survival here is not predator against prey, but life against erasure." Marcus turned his head, shielding Emily, his fur collecting white frost. The rival stumbled closer, not in attack, but in shared desperation. For a moment, two hunters stood not as enemies, but as victims of the same collapse. Emily's eyes widened, innocence bearing witness to truths adults never admit. The narrator said, Every revelation strips away illusion. In that frozen silence between gusts, the Arctic revealed its law. The environment is judge, jury, and executioner. The snow thinned briefly, revealing the rival bear slumping to his knees, ribs rising and falling like a drum of desperation. The narrator said, "The twist is simple. Survival is not conquest, but coexistence, and both may still lose." Marcus stood firm, his scars glowing under the dim light, Emily pressed tight against his chest. He looked at the rival not with hatred, but with weary understanding. The flow shifted, ice breaking further, reminding them that time belonged not to predator nor prey. The narrator said, "The hidden truth cuts sharper than claws. The Arctic itself is the true shadow of survival." The storm ripped across the floes, tearing the world into chaos. The narrator said, "This is the breaking point. Survival demands blood." Marcus braced against the gale, his massive frame shielding Emily as shards of ice sliced through the air. The rival rose again, staggering forward with hollow eyes, driven not by malice but starvation. His roar cracked through the storm, echoing against the endless sea. Emily whimpered, pressing closer into Marcus's chest. The narrator said, "The climax is not victory, but confrontation with extinction." Every breath came ragged, every second a countdown. There was no more waiting. The fight had begun. Marcus lunged, his scarred muzzle snapping claws carving lines into the ice. The narrator said, "Climax comes with violence, swift and merciless." The rival met him head-on, teeth clashing, snow erupting beneath their weight. Emily cried out, her small body trembling in the shadows of giants. Marcus roared, chest heaving, forcing the rival backward with raw fury. Yet hunger made the younger bear relentless. He lunged again, teeth raking Marcus' shoulder. Blood stained the snow, bright against the white. The narrator said, "Every strike is a heartbeat lost." This was not a hunt. It was survival written in blood. The ice shattered under their struggle, water rushing up in black torrents. The narrator said, "The climax is merciless, swallowing all who linger." Marcus slipped, one paw plunging into the freezing sea, his roar torn into fragments by the wind. The rival lunged, pressing advantage, but Marcus twisted with feral strength, driving his weight against him. They crashed together, snow exploding in violent bursts. Emily shrieked, her cry piercing louder than the storm. The narrator said, "This is the edge of extinction, written in muscle, claw, and fear." Both bears teetered at the brink, the world splitting beneath their struggle. Marcus roared, a sound deeper than storm, and forced the rival toward the edge. The narrator said, "Every climax is sacrifice." The rival clawed furiously, but the ice betrayed him, splintering under his weight. His paw slipped, plunging into black water, body teetering with desperation. Marcus's jaws snapped down, but hesitation froze him. This was not an enemy, but a reflection. Emily squealed, her small body trembling, her innocence slicing through the chaos. The narrator said, "In every climax lies choice, even when choice is agony." For a heartbeat, the storm paused, then the ice gave way. The rival plunged, his body crashing into the sea with a roar drowned by waves. The narrator said, "The climax ends not with triumph, but with silence." Marcus stood panting, chest heaving, his fur streaked with blood and frost. Emily crawled to his side, pressing against him, her innocence trembling in relief. He lowered his head, touching her gently, though his eyes carried no victory, only grief. The sea swallowed the rival, leaving only ripples against the jagged ice. The narrator said, "Every climax leaves a scar, written not in glory, but in loss." Marcus roared once more, his cry breaking through the storm, not of triumph but of survival against inevitability. The storm began to fade, leaving silence that felt heavier than the roar. The narrator said, "Every battle leaves echoes." Marcus stood trembling, blood staining his white fur, ribs rising and falling with exhaustion. Emily pressed close, her small body warm against his chest. The rival was gone, swallowed by the sea, his absence etched deeper than his presence. The floes drifted farther apart, carrying Marcus and Emily into greater isolation. The narrator said, "Survival here is never victory, only continuation." The Arctic lay quiet, as if mocking the cost of endurance. Marcus lowered his head, eyes half closed, not in triumph but in surrender to inevitability. The sea calmed, dark water stretching endlessly, broken only by drifting shards of ice. The narrator said, "Resolution comes not with peace, but with inevitability." Marcus lowered himself to the floe, chest heaving, his eyes locked on Emily as she curled into his fur. Hunger gnawed sharper than wounds, yet he pressed his muzzle against her softly. His scarred body shook, but his gaze remained steady. She was all that tethered him to breath. The narrator said, "Legacy is not survival of one, but survival of another." The Arctic gave nothing in return, but Marcus endured, if only for the cub resting in his shadow. The horizon bled pale orange as the storm clouds parted, revealing a fleeting sun. The narrator said, "Even in ruin, light returns." Emily stirred, blinking sleepily at the glow, her innocence unbroken. Marcus lifted his head slowly, scars catching the sun like fading marks of war. His body trembled, but his will endured. The floes drifted into endless sea, a fragile raft carrying 2 lives. The narrator said, "Resolution is cruel, yet it binds past to future." The Arctic did not forgive, but for this fleeting moment it allowed. Marcus pressed his muzzle to Emily's head, a gesture of promise. But the cracks spread wider, floes breaking into smaller fragments, water swallowing more of their world. The narrator said, "Resolution is not safety, it is knowing survival cannot last forever." Marcus rose, paws unsteady, carrying Emily closer to the center of the shrinking floe. She stumbled, but he nudged her gently, his scarred muzzle pressed against her side. Hunger roared inside him, louder than the sea. The narrator said, "Every ending holds the weight of inevitability." Marcus stared into the endless horizon, his frame framed by silence, carrying both victory and grief in the same breath. The narrator said, "Resolution ties back to the beginning. The ice that betrayed is the same ice that remains." Marcus stood tall though broken, Emily pressed at his side, their shadows stretching thin across the floe. The silence of the Arctic was louder than the storm. The rival's absence lingered, a ghost swallowed by the sea, yet his fate was also theirs. The narrator said, "Nature is not cruel nor kind, it is absolute." Marcus lifted his head to the pale horizon, his breath a cloud fading quickly into the cold air. For now they endured. For now, the story remained unfinished. The Arctic lay silent, its storm spent, its horizon endless. The narrator said, "The echo begins not in noise, but in silence." Marcus stood tall though trembling, scars etched deep into his fur, his breath drifting like ghosts above the ice. Emily pressed close, her small frame barely more than a flicker of warmth against him. The floe cracked again, soft and final, reminding them the ground itself would never hold. The sea swallowed the sound, keeping it forever. The narrator said, "What remains after survival is not victory, it is memory." Their shadows stretched thin across the white, dissolving into the fading light. Emily lifted her head, eyes wide at the horizon, blinking against the cold. The narrator said, "The echo carries forward through innocence." Her small body trembled, but she did not let go. Marcus lowered his scarred muzzle, brushing her gently, his breath a faint promise against the silence. The Arctic stretched infinite around them, vast, empty, unrelenting. The narrator said, "Even in endings, fragility can still anchor hope." The floe groaned beneath, but for a moment, the 2 figures stood untouched, fragile guardians in a world no longer theirs. The narrator said, "The Arctic itself bears witness, and it remembers." Snow drifted gently now, falling in thin, endless sheets. Marcus lifted his head toward the sky, eyes catching the dim light of a fading sun. Emily nestled closer, her small body shaking in rhythm with the ice beneath. The silence felt eternal, broken only by the faint sound of water lapping against the floe. The narrator said, "Survival is not endless, it is borrowed." Each heartbeat was both triumph and countdown. The Arctic stood still, holding the moment like an eternal echo. The floe shuddered again, sending cracks spiraling like veins across its surface. The narrator said, "The echo is fragility, stretching thinner with each breath." Marcus shifted his stance, steadying Emily with his body. His scarred face bore no fear, only endurance. The sea gurgled beneath, black and endless, mocking the fragility of ice. Emily whimpered softly, but clung tighter, her innocence the only defiance left. The narrator said, "The echo lives because life still breathes, even in the shadow of extinction." The ice groaned louder, carrying their weight like a fading memory. The horizon swallowed the sun, leaving only shadow. The narrator said, "The echo is final, yet it lingers." Marcus lowered his head, muzzle pressed to Emily's fur, a gesture of quiet farewell disguised as comfort. The sea lapped against the floe, carrying them deeper into emptiness. Silence grew absolute, yet within it, one truth remained unbroken: they endured. The narrator said, "The last line of the Arctic is not written in victory, but in survival, fragile, fleeting, unforgettable." The final image lingered, sharp as a wound, a bear and his cub, stranded on melting ice, nowhere left to run.